Alright, so Palworld, or some people have been calling it Pokemon with guns. Before we get into the review, something I like to do is if you already played the game and you're just kind of like watching videos on it, it would be helpful to a lot of people if you post your review in the comment section so that there's like some unbiased reviews in the comments, you know? And then if you want, you can reply to it after watching the video. Maybe if your opinion's changed at all or something, I don't know. But yeah, because ultimately reviews are to help people decide whether or not to buy a game. So, help people out. Should they buy the game or not? But my current score for the game is a 6.8 out of 10, which for context is on like a new rating scale that I'm using. You can check out a video I made on it for a better explanation, but basically a 6 is average, a 7 is good, so this just falls slightly short of what I would consider good. So like a 7 or above is a game that I would generally recommend to people. And this game's at a point where I'm like, maybe I'll recommend it to people in the future. At the moment, I'm kind of just like, maybe don't get the game. I mean, I guess it has like a decent amount of stuff to do for the price, but like at the same time, it often left me wanting to play other games, which is kind of a big problem. And so, it could definitely be a game worth getting, especially if it seems like particularly interesting to you. But like in general, I would say maybe wait, see if there's updates that make it better first. I don't think you would regret buying it, but I also think there might be better games to get, so. Alright, so I gotta mention the controversy around Palworld. So the big one is basically people saying that, like, they plagiarized Pokemon, that some of the pals are, like, exact copies of Pokemon, which isn't true. Like, you can definitely see the resemblance to Pokemon, but they're all just slightly different enough to where they're clearly not the same thing. And the reason behind that is because it's basically a parody. People call the game Pokemon with guns, which is an absurd concept and, like, definitely a parody, right? Like, Pokemon is not having Pokemon with guns. Like, that's not something they're ever actually gonna do. It's absurd. That's kind of the whole thing. And so the pals look like Pokemon because that's the whole point. The gimmick of the game is that these creatures look like Pokemon or something similar. But it's not because it makes developing the game easier. It isn't just some lazy copy. It's an intentional design choice to make you think of Pokemon. Not only that, but like the Pokemon art style wasn't ever particularly original. Many of the design features were taken from other Japanese games like Dragon Quest. Like they were kind of just following popular trends in the 90s, and since then they've kind of taken on like their own personality a bit, and they definitely were what popularized this style in the West, like in the US. But yeah, the designs are fun, and then there's also some people saying like, oh, it's just AI or whatever, which no, it's not. That doesn't really make sense. Like the final product, at least, clearly isn't AI generated. The one place where AI may have been used is like concept art, but I mean, this game's been in development for quite a while. People are pointing out, like, I guess it was a Twitter post or X, whatever you want to call it, from one of the creators of the game, where they were talking about like how AI can be used to make fake Pokemon. But this happened after the game had already been in development for a while, and a lot of the pals are already designed, so it's like maybe they used AI to come up with some concepts for like some of the pals towards the end of the game. I don't know, but it's like if they used AI, it was used in a way where I simply don't care. Like it was used in like such a tiny, insignificant aspect that it doesn't matter. Like people had to make the assets for the game, and that's kind of it. Alright, so the gameplay will be very familiar to you if you've played other survival games. Like, the game is very much like Ark in particular. There are some key differences, but like the core gameplay loop is pretty much the same. You get these creatures to help you like get materials to build stuff that cost increasingly more resources, and then you advance through like a tech tree to unlock more crafting recipes, like to build bigger buildings and better gear and all that stuff. But some differences are like how the game's locked to third person, which I prefer first-person games generally, but it all just comes down to personal preference. Another difference is capturing pals is near instantaneous rather than having to wait long times to tame, which leads to something that I want to talk about more later, so just hold on to that thought. Something else that makes it kind of unique is that, the creatures, the pals, are tied to your inventory, and you have to like switch between active pals, so you can't just like have like an army follow you around. And then there's also no PvP so far, but that's set to change. There is planned updates coming. There is going to be PvP. Another game that it's really similar to, and is very obvious in the movement, is Genshin Impact. The movement is basically Genshin Impact's movement. Stamina is used for swimming and climbing and using your glider, and climbing can be done up like nearly any vertical surface. It's basically Genshin Impact's movement, which, I mean, it's kind of neat at first, but I don't actually like this whole movement style. I feel like it makes navigating the world actually more annoying somehow. So the game is like technically a survival game. You start with pretty much nothing. You have hunger you have to manage. You have temperature that can be a problem. But yeah, like the survival elements don't really feel balanced. Like food is so easy to find. Like you will not have issues having food in your inventory. Like I have infinite berries in my inventory and everything eats berries. Like it's really, like I have never had a situation where I couldn't just, you know, use like 50 berries and fix all my hunger problems. Like, but then the game goes on and is like, oh, now we're gonna grow wheat to make bread. You know, you have to grow the wheat, you have to mill the wheat, and then you have to cook the bread, and it's like berries. I could just use berries. Same thing. The food items don't heal you or anything. They will restore some sanity, which sanity is this like thing that pals have, but one of the first things they tell you to do is to build a hot tub, and then when the pals sanity gets low, they just take a break and go use the hot tub, and then they come back at max sanity most of the time. And it's the only times you'd actually need to like force feed a pal to raise their sanity is when the AI isn't working, which does happen from time to time. But like in terms of actual balancing, the game is not the most balanced. The game is incredibly easy for this genre, you know, survival games, which is both a good and bad thing. Like, I particularly hate how easy games have been getting. I made a whole video on it. But this genre of game is also notoriously difficult and often for the wrong reasons. Like, Ark, for example, has tasks that on the standard settings can take multiple days, which is just absurd. Like, you pretty much have to do it as a group, and you have to, like, take turns, like, who's on at any given time, and it's just... it's ridiculous. Ark has a problem where the game often feels more like a job than a game. And in good news, Palworld really does not have that problem, at least not most of the time. Because there's just a lot of like quality of life decisions implemented in the game to make it feel like a game at all times. You know, in particular, there's like fast traveling in the game, and you get to like carry your inventory while you're fast traveling, which is often not done in survival games. You know, survival games often want you to travel like the treacherous environment and be at constant risk. This game really doesn't do that. And, you know, things typically don't take like absurd lengths of time. You know, and the few times they do, like with like building or something, you know, there are ways to cut down on those times. You know, using your pals to help you build can like cut the time from like several minutes to just a few seconds. So, whereas in a game like Ark or something, they would just keep it at several minutes. That said, the combat is really easy most of the time, and it's not particularly interesting. There are level gaps that allow you to make like more challenging decisions, but like the challenge is typically just in health and damage numbers, and it's done in a way where like if something's, you know, a few levels higher than you, like you'll be doing like 1 damage per hit. So it's basically impossible to fight enemies that are too high of a level, which is just kind of annoying to me. I feel like difficulty should come more in, you know, like how much of a challenge it is to maybe dodge the enemy's abilities or something like that, you know, because like the attacks are nearly all like variants on dashes, projectiles, and like the occasional area of effect attack, and they're pretty much all like extremely predictable when they're not being buggy, which that's an issue we'll get into a bit later. You know, like sometimes you don't know exactly what the enemy's doing just because the enemy doesn't know what they're doing. You know, the boss fights are really weird. I don't like there's like a time limit on them, and you know, the first time I fought like the first boss or whatever, you know, because of the whole way like the leveling works, it was just impossible for me to do enough damage in the time period. The fight wasn't actually difficult, it was just the fact that I couldn't possibly do enough DPS to win. But, I mean, there is an interesting part of combat, and that is damage types. You know, this is definitely something that's been done in games before, but not really in, like, this survival game setting. And so, like, your pals have, like, types that make them, like, either stronger or weaker to other types. You know, like, water-based pals are weak to electric attacks. And then your pals can learn, like, different moves that have different move types. So, like, maybe your pal could have, like, grass type and ground type attacks. You know, something like that. You know, pretty much like how Pokemon works, but in a very different type of combat, which can be interesting. You know, I think it is something that like if Pokemon wanted like a kind of like real-time battling game, they could take this idea and run with it. The base building is pretty rough. The things you can build are pretty limited. Structures often don't want to snap together right, and it all really seems to confuse the AI. The defenses you can build also never did anything for me, no matter how many times I tested them. So I don't know if they're just not working yet, or I don't know. But yeah, so overall, like the gameplay is okay, but it gets boring a bit quickly. You know, there's definitely a lot of fun aspects to it, and it is early access, and there's a lot of room for improvement. So, you know, it could be really good, but at the moment, it's just kind of okay. It's decently fun, and the game's $30, so, you know, in terms of gameplay, it's okay. So the game has some annoying performance issues. I mean, of course it is early access, and there is an easy way to report issues, which is a good sign. And I certainly haven't seen anything game breaking. So the performance definitely isn't the worst. But that said, like enemies would fairly often just like warp around. Both enemies and my pals would get stuck in walls and floors regularly. You know, sometimes my pals would just fall from the sky while working and have to be taken to a bed to heal. And then the AI would very often just quit working like altogether. Like enemies would occasionally just stop fighting back for some reason, and friendlies would need to be reset by recalling them to get them to actually do anything. Then there's the fact that the same action button is used for pretty much everything, which causes a ton of issues. I think it wasn't thought out enough, and it's just incredibly annoying at times. And then, you know, there is some like frame rate issues here and there, but nothing too crazy. I mean, overall, the game runs good enough. I think the biggest issue is really with the AI, but it is an early access, so I will give it a bit of leniency there. Alright, so it's Pokemon with guns, right? The tone of the game is just weird. It just doesn't feel right. Like, the pals are designed to look very cute, but you have to, like, beat them up or shoot them to capture them. And then they're just, like, blindly loyal to you like they have Stockholm Syndrome or something, because you shot them and then now you're feeding them and they love you, and it feels wrong. It feels very wrong. Which, you know, can be funny here and there, but I feel like it gets old pretty quickly. It also looks like a very child-friendly game, and much of the game actually is. Like, much of the game is basically just Pokemon in terms of, like, how child-friendly it is. But then you'll randomly be hit with, like, mildly inappropriate dialogue or, like, dark themes out of nowhere, and it's kind of weird. I'm not one to say, like, what games you should or shouldn't let your kids play, but I do think you should know it's more mature than it looks on the surface. You know, I'd say it's more mature than Pokemon for sure, more mature than Fortnite even, when they're shooting each other. You know, the game definitely wasn't designed for children. But, you know, I played much worse games as a kid, so. You know, for example, like when you defeat enemies, it kind of just looks like they're knocked out. You know, they're presumably still alive. But then some of the pals will, like, go up and do, like, a eating animation, and then after a bit, the body disappears. And, you know, it's not graphic, but it is definitely darker than the cartoony nature would imply. You can also butcher your pals. I think that's very dark. And then something just kind of, like, tonally weird is that, so, like, when you defeat an enemy in battle, you know, they don't die. You know, in fact, when you capture an enemy, it counts as defeating them. And when they're defeated, they drop items like meat, bones, and organs, which is bizarre. So, like, every single pal that you've captured, you have, like, their meat or organs or something just in your inventory now. And it's like, you could feed them their own meat. I don't understand what's supposed to be happening there, but it doesn't feel right. I mean, it is kind of funny, though, but like I said, like, kind of the funniness to it gets old after a bit. Overall, it often feels like the cartoonish aspects of the game are constantly fighting with the survival aspects of the game. Like, the tone is just never quite right, which, you know, can create kind of this, like, funny, like, absurd element to it. But like I said, just, like, the absurdity gets old. You know, a lot of the kind of more absurd elements to the game are really unnecessary, I feel like. Like, the game could easily be a good, like, E-rated game, combining both survival and, like, the whole Pokemon deal. And I think it would be much better for it. Because, like, the guns are, I mean, they're not particularly strong or anything. You know, they kind of just don't really fit in tonally. It's kind of more just like a, haha, this is funny. But like I said, the funny aspect of it gets old pretty quickly. But, you know, maybe it's something that you personally like. I don't know. So yeah, if you're experienced with survival games, this is probably going to be a lackluster experience for you in that aspect. But if you're new to the genre, this could be a good entry point because it goes really easy on you while still familiarizing you with, you know, the common gameplay mechanics for the genre. You know, like the hunger, dropping all your loot when you die, collecting resources to build, all that. Now, if we ignore the survival elements and just do like combat and dungeons, well, Genshin Impact is free to play and very similar in effect, and more polished. Like, the only two reasons to get the game is you really like the gimmick, or more practically, you just want an easier survival game. Which I think that last thing, you know, just wanting an easier survival game, is the one area where I would recommend the game. You know, if you want an easier survival game, then yeah, this is probably a good game to get. Now, I am interested in seeing where the game goes. It is still in early access, and I'm sure there is still room for unique content to make it really stand out. Maybe like breeding unique PAL variants that have different stats, elements, and skills. You know, kind of like Pokemon's regional variants, but like you make them yourself, maybe? Because you already like use these eggs. There's a lot they could do with that, I think. You know, it kind of like reminds me a bit of like the Chow Gardens from the Sonic Adventure games. You know, and if you combine some element like that with like You know, there's supposed to be these challenging like raid boss fights that you need to really plan for. You know, if those turn out well, I think you could have something really special with this game. But so yeah, my current score is a 6.8 out of 10. If the game looks really interesting to you, it's only $30, so you may want to get it. Just know that it's really nothing amazing. A lot of the popularity behind the game is just because of controversy and the silly gimmick of it being Pokemon with guns. The game itself isn't going to blow you away, but it's also not bad or anything, so it's like meh. But I almost feel like playing a game like Ark but with like custom settings, it's probably going to be more enjoyable, to be honest. I mean, that's constantly how I felt. I was like, I could just play Ark, I could just go play Pokemon. You know, I mean, I guess you can't get both of those things together, but it rarely felt like both of those things were working together. It almost always felt like you were either playing a survival game or playing like a creature game. Like, it rarely felt like you were doing both at the same time, because like the two elements just don't really fit together right. I think you could make them fit together good. I just don't think they do in this game. So yeah, that was my Palworld review. Let me know in the comments what you think of the game. You know, would you give it a higher score or lower score? If you liked the video, or if the video helped you make a decision at all, it would help me a lot if you hit the like button. And if you want to see more from me, be sure to hit the subscribe button as well. I think that's it for today, so yeah, see you around.
The enemy doesn't know what they're doing.